Hi, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. We are so excited to have you joining for our webinar today. This is the second part of our two-part series on integrating UX research into product development to help product teams partner better with their UX research peers. My name is Katie. I'm a part of the team here at AnswerLab. And before we get started, I just want to run through a few quick housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded and everyone will receive a copy of the recording via email afterwards. So if for any reason you're disconnected or have to run to another meeting, we'll make sure you still get the content, and we'll also share a copy of the deck in our follow-up materials. If you have any questions that you'd like to submit, please do so via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll try our best to answer them at the end of the session. And we're going to do our best to keep this to 45 minutes so you can stay on track for the rest of your day. So we'll get you to your next meeting on time at the top of the hour. Next slide. So for those of you who haven't heard of AnswerLab, we are a full-service user experience research firm that helps product teams navigate how research can fit into product development. So we combine deep UX research expertise with industry understanding and context to help you uncover user needs and optimize your product features for maximum impact. Next slide. And with that, I am excited to turn it over to our speaker, Molly Kessler. Molly originally launched her career in product management and transitioned over to UX research from that role because of her love for data-driven user insights. Today, Molly is a senior UX research manager at AnswerLab. She's been with us for almost 6 years now, and I'm really excited for you all to hear what she has to share today. So Molly, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Katie. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you joined me for the first webinar in this series, I really want to thank you for coming back. If you didn't join webinar 1, in that one, I focused on identifying the right research objectives so that you can choose the right methodology and get the data that you need from UX research, and then also how to fit that research into your product roadmap. Today's content is about taking the next step after research is completed. And it's also geared towards product managers, and it hits on 2 main points. First, how to interpret UX research insights. And second, how product managers can prioritize and act on the recommendations based on those insights. As I mentioned in my previous webinar, or if you're new to me with this webinar, I have worked in both roles as a product manager and as a UX researcher. And to me, these 2 topics are just as important for researchers as they are for product managers. Every UXR wants their insights to be understood, to be talked about, remembered, and most importantly, acted on. I know what it's like to write a report on research and think, how can I most effectively communicate these findings? How can I ensure that stakeholders listen to them? Will the team make any changes based on my work? It's so important, those questions, to make a UX researcher feel fulfilled and valuable in their work. So UX researchers and product managers both working to bring a team together to hear and discuss research insights and align on what actions to take based on them is the best way to make decisions for your product that will make it more useful, more usable for the customer, as well as more successful in the market. So just a high-level overview of what I'm going to cover today. So anyone who has presented a webinar or attended a webinar knows that one of the biggest challenges is presenting content that is general enough, to apply to most of you all, most of the audience, but also specific enough that you feel like you come away from the webinar with some actionable tips and nuggets. So for today, I really wanted to focus on something actionable. So I'm going to present a step-by-step framework for taking insights and turning them into decisions, as well as some tips on how to put the framework into practice. So the 3 steps that I'll cover at the top of the slide there are categorizing the findings and insights that you get, categorizing the recommendations that you get, and then acting according to those categories. And the actions that I'm going to cover are prioritizing, solving, and sharing. And then for best practices, I'm going to talk about customizing the output of UX research to make it easier for teams to act on the findings and the recommendations, and then talk about some best practices for documenting these decisions that you make, and if possible, measuring the impact of those decisions. So let's dive into these 3 steps you can take to turn your insights into decisions. Okay, so let's say that you have just gotten a report back from some research that you had done, and this is what you might feel like you have. It's a bunch of research findings or research insights and their associated recommendations, but they're just sort of like floating around in the report, right? You're not sure what to do with them or which ones to prioritize. Step 1 is to categorize the findings and insights by type. And today I'm going to talk about 3 types of insights that you can get from UX research. I do want to point out that these 3 types, they do apply to both foundational and evaluative research. And there are, of course, more than 3 types of insights, and there are more than 3 ways to look at this. But I like this framework because I have found that dividing findings into these 3 categories is a great first step towards deciding what to act on. So here are the 3 categories. Findings can be positive, common, or high impact. Positive findings are findings that validate ideas or concepts or work you've done, right? Prototypes, designs. I've got some examples on the slide. All participants completed the checkout process because they found the steps easy to understand and act on from start to finish. Another example might be most segment 1 participants said they would click on the offer because it matched their typical shopping needs. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on positive findings because they're typically the least actionable of the 3 types of findings, but they're still really important. You maybe thought your customer was doing a certain behavior, now you know they are. You hypothesized that your prototype was easy to use, now you know it is. You assumed that you had 3 different mindsets in your customer base, but now you know what those mindsets are. This validation is a really important output of UX research because you do need to be sure, right? You need to have data confirming that what you're building is not a waste of resources and money, that it's meeting expectations and doing the job. But besides a very basic, like, continue with X or keep doing Y, you're probably not going to need to make or prioritize a lot of hard decisions based on positive findings. A UX researcher can list these so that you have them documented, but they don't need to take up a lot of time or space in the story that the research report is telling, and they don't need to take up a lot of time and space in the team discussion. That said, they can be really valuable for influencing within your organization and bringing teams together. So when you get these positive findings, I'd encourage you to please still share them, right? Share them with designers and developers so that they can see that their good work was successful in the research. Share them with leadership to grow confidence in your product and confidence in your team's work. So don't forget to celebrate and make these successes really visible within your team and your entire organization. Second category, common findings. These represent themes. And again, I have 2 examples here. Most participants failed to discover the self-service option in the app because it was not located under the help menu where they expected to find it. Or something like, half of the participants expected the purchase flow to be over after clicking the CTA, and they reported feeling both surprised and disappointed to discover another step. So these are trends, right, that the UX researcher observed or heard across multiple participants in the study. They're included in the report as themes, meaning there was enough data supporting them, right? That the UXR identified them as a trend that is going to require a change to the stimuli or a change to the concept. Or if foundational research, they're saying, oh, here's a mindset, right? This goes against the hypothesis that we had. These findings usually make up the bulk of a UX research report, since really this is the value of talking to 6 or 10 or 12 users, right? To see the common themes that emerge from a group. Final category, high impact. So these findings or insights are different than common because they might only be mentioned or observed by 1 or 2 participants, but they carry a significant impact for a specific type of user, a population, or sometimes a marginalized group. So a couple examples on this slide. Both participants age 65 plus described the content as unhelpful because they believe the long-term focus did not apply to their life stage. One participant who used a screen magnifier stated that the next step from the screen was unclear because the submit button was outside the field of their view on the far right of the screen. So typically a finding that a UX researcher hears from only one participant doesn't make its way into the report. But a good researcher will identify when a one-off comment is actually a showstopper and highlight it in their reporting. To show how impactful these types of insights will be, I have this example of how a high impact finding saved a team from taking what could have potentially been a really big misstep, right, and alienating some story. So this was a study that AnswerLab did for a financial services company where we were getting user feedback on new web pages about retirement services. And the content we were testing included a header graphic with the title that said, "Retirement Income Matters." A Black participant mentioned during the study that he felt the headline was co-opting Black Lives Matter for marketing purposes. And the design team was really appreciative of this feedback because the connection was not intentional. So as a result, they did use a different slogan around retirement income in the final version of these web pages when they launched it. The team didn't want their headline to come across as trying to capitalize on the hard work of activists. So this study had a sample size of n equals 6 with one Black participant. So in addition to showing how an insight from one user should still be included in a UX research report and acted on by the team, it also shows the importance of inclusive recruiting, which is something we feel really strongly about at AnswerLab. The demographics of your participants in your study are really important for bringing diverse perspectives into your research so that you can get learnings like this one. Okay, so bringing us back to this example where you have these findings and the recommendations that you got from your recent report, now you can categorize those findings into positive, common, and high impact. And as a next step towards figuring out how to act on these, you can remove the positive findings from your list. As I mentioned, those are great for celebrating, sharing, spreading goodwill, but they don't typically require hard decisions and action. So you've now narrowed down your pool of insights to the ones that do require action from you right now and decisions. And that is the common and high impact findings. So now you're ready to move to step 2 in this framework, which is categorizing the recommendations in your report. So here again, I have 3 simple categories that you can use as a lens to review the recommendations in your report and figure out your next step. On the left, the first type of recommendation is one that is within your control and it has a clear solution. I've got an example here. Update the button text to start application to meet users' expectations for the next step. So in this example, let's say your team owns that button, right? The screen that the button is on, you're the ones owning that button, and you can change the text on it, right? Like that's up to you. It's also clear from this recommendation what you should change it to, right? The research told you that start application is what is going to resonate with users to make this button user-friendly. The column in the middle, these recommendations are also within your control, but in this case, there's no clear solution. So the example I have here is something like adjust the location of the CTA to make it easier for users to find. So again, imagine that this CTA button is something your team owns and you have the ability to move it. But in this case, the research only told you that users can't find it in its current location, right? The location that you tested. There was no strong signal in this example from participants on where the CTA button should be moved to. No real solution. And then finally, on the right side, you've got your recommendations that are going to be ultimately outside your control. The example I have here is something like shorten the terms and conditions text so that users don't feel overwhelmed. So this is a great recommendation, right? Like the research told them the pain point, the terms and conditions text was too long. And these participants made the solution clear, right? If it was shorter, I wouldn't feel so overwhelmed. But in this example, this text is coming to you from legal clients, right? So it's not text that your team owns or is able to just change. So outside your control. So taking us back to our example of our findings we're looking at from our report, you can now take a look at each recommendation and categorize them into these three buckets. Within your control, clear solution. Within your control, no clear solution. Outside your control. So now we've got all kinds of categories, and it's time for the third step, which is to use those categories to determine your next action. And the three actions I'm going to talk about that your team can take is prioritize, solve, and share. So for the recommendations that are within your control and they have a clear solution, the next step is to prioritize those changes or updates. I'm sure you've all seen this exercise before, right? That I have shown on this slide, but it's a really good one, plotting the impact versus the effort. So I recommend in this case that you get your stakeholders together for a workshop where you can do this exercise. Look at each recommendation one at a time and place it on this matrix. What is the impact to the user, low to high? And this piece, honestly, should come from your UX research report. Like, if you're a UX researcher, summarize your recommendations in the report and prioritize them from most impact on the user to least impact on the user. You saw the impact firsthand if you were running qualitative sessions. So you can help this step of the framework go faster for the whole team by listing your recommendations in order, most impact to the user first. And then plotting effort, low to high. This often means getting your developers involved, which is great, right? It just brings the whole team together and lets you plot those recommendations accurately. So for the recommendations that are within your control but don't have a clear solution that came out of the research, your next step is to solve, right? So these recommendations need to go back into your UX pipeline. Come up with a solution or multiple solutions that might fix the pain point or address the expectation or mindset and improve the experience. So again, I recommend looking at each recommendation as a team and deciding what needs an updated design, what needs an updated prototype, what needs to be tested again in a future round of research. And when you come up with those tasks, assign them to people or to teams, right? The updates, the new versions, the new direction, give each one an owner, put a name on it and a due date on it. This step, solving for pain points that came out of the research without clear answers, is where you can iterate, right? And test again until you either do get those clear solutions that you can prioritize, or maybe you get those positive findings, right? Validation that your solutions show you're ready to launch. So for the final type of recommendation outside your control, the only action you can really take really is to share. And there are a lot of reasons why a recommendation from UX research could be outside of your control. So maybe the content or the screens are owned by another team. Like in my example before, maybe your hands are tied by legal compliance, or maybe it's a back-end limitation. Probably back-end limitations are a really fun one that everyone on this call is familiar with. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I still want to take the opportunity to advise you and encourage you to share the research. So be really generous with your findings. You never know when hearing something for the second, the third, the fourth, the 100th time could push another team to change, right? Or make the case for those back-end updates, right? The girl can dream. So much like the positive findings I mentioned earlier, you can use recommendations outside your control to influence within your organization. Reach out, build your network, be a team player, make connections across teams. I'm sure you all agree that data should be shared, so don't be shy. All right, back to our example. So now you can take the categorized recommendations and you can split them into those next steps that I just talked about. The recommendations within your control that have a clear solution can be prioritized. That's on the left here. And that's where you need to focus your decisions right now for your product. What needs to be developed and launched, and in what order. In the middle, within your control, with no solution, you do have some next steps here, right? For creating solutions and continuing to test. But you don't have any immediate decisions to make because future research on those solutions should drive your decision. And then to the right, outside your control, who knows like what, if anything, will happen based on that data, but that's okay. At least you tried. So let's focus for a moment on the left side of this slide, the recommendations that are ready to build on launch. So using the exercise I talked about before in like a workshop setting, here's how those recommendations could look, plotted onto a matrix by low to high impact to the user and low to high effort to build. And what I added here is this red circle. That is actually a red square. This red square. And this is a decision that will vary from organization to organization based on the resources that you have, right, behind your effort. But basically, it represents solutions that are worth it to execute, right? Recommendations that are worth it. So they're high enough impact and low enough effort. So you can see in this example, one of the common findings in the UX research report, it did have a clear solution within your control, but that recommendation is being deemed high effort and just below medium impact. So in this example, it falls outside of this circle, this square, sorry, of changes that are worth making, right? So once you've plotted your recommendations and decided which ones are worth it, the final step here is to turn each one into an action statement, right? And assign them to a team or. So take your list and take your plotted recommendations and make a list. This person will update. This person will build. This team will move forward. This team will launch. And that's it, right? Congratulations. You went from these floating findings and recommendations to this list on the right. You know, you took your findings, categorized them, you took the associated recommendations and categorized those. You took the ones that had a clear solution and you prioritized them and turned them into this list of decisions, right? The decisions are listed as actions. Each action has a number. So I really hope that the way I've laid out these steps and talked about them today, and as Katie mentioned, we'll be sharing out this deck as well, helps you have a start for a clear plan, right? Next time you get a UX research report on your customers or product. So that takes me to the second topic for today, which are some best practices within this framework. And I apparently love things in threes because there are three categories here: customize, document, and manage. So customizing research deliverables. How can UX research reports be more actionable? So the UX researcher plays a really big role in setting the team up for success when it comes to interpreting and acting on insights. And this is true in a lot of ways, right? Clarity of the reporting, strength of the recommendations, etc. But one important way is customizing your reports to meet the team. The more you can customize your deliverable to make your findings and your recommendations actionable, the easier it will be to turn them into decisions. So at the beginning of each project, the UXR should ask themselves, who is my audience for this report? What format will they read or digest or watch most likely? And what do they need to do with this data? So I have some examples and recommendations on this slide. A spreadsheet or list being the first one. I know I talked about this in the first webinar, but a list of recommendations can be really useful for developers because it can be easily translated into Jira or any other ticketing system, versus if you have findings that need to go up to a leadership meeting, you might then choose a designed deck of slides, right? And when you're thinking about slides versus a doc, really think about like, what will people read? I have seen reports put into Slack. I have seen reports put into Confluence. Wherever your audience is for the report, meet them where they are, right? Put the insights there. Including charts and tables and visuals and icons, those can really help you drive home the findings and also make your findings easier to digest, easier to remember, and a lot of times easier to share, right? Like a screen grab of an impactful infographic can get shared around a lot more easily than a large slide deck. Screenshots I have in here, that's really important for usability research, right? For evaluative research, because it's going to tie your report back to the stimuli so that if someone is reading the report, they can see what the user was seeing and really understand the impact of those findings. I also have GIFs on here. So at AnswerLab, like full disclosure, we're lucky enough to have a team of visual designers that helps us visualize our reports. And I have seen them use animation and motion to really bring to life a pain point or even sometimes a proposed solution. And it really grabs the attention and leaves an impact on the reader. So all that to say, don't be afraid to get creative with your format and do whatever is most useful to the team that's getting the report. On the right, sharing short quotes and clips out is something I always recommend. I think I recommended it the first webinar, but I'll recommend it again. If you're trying to build empathy, having your team read a couple quotes that come directly from the participants or watch a couple clips of participants struggling to use the product can really be impactful. But taking that a step further, so if you're running qualitative sessions, you are doing maybe 6 hours, maybe 12 hours sessions. And if your stakeholders are too busy to watch, the one small and simple thing you can do that is extremely helpful is when you share the recordings of your sessions, just recommend the top 1 or 2 sessions for stakeholders to watch, right? They are really busy and the scope of watching 6 hours of sessions is really big. But if you share out those recordings and say something like, hey, session 4 was really a great participant, super engaging, said some really interesting things, I'd start there. Or session 5 was really indicative. That participant was really indicative of the themes in the report. So if you want to see a lot of the themes in the report in action and hear them from the user, start there. It immediately takes like the scope of like catching up on session recordings down to just 1 or 2 hours, much more reasonable. And it also makes sure they won't waste time. Like no one wants to just like randomly choose which session to start with. You might get an outlier, right? You might get a dud. Some participants are duds. So this kind of eliminates that and makes sure that your stakeholders are putting their best foot forward. And then hosting a watch party is really one step further than that. I also think it's pretty fun for the clients I've seen do it. Basically, you select the session that you think is most impactful or maybe most representative of put in the report, and you set time on calendars for everybody to watch it together. You can chat and talk about what you hear and have some fun with it and make sure everybody keeps that dedicated time to get engaged with research. So speaking of getting engaged with research, my final recommendation at the bottom there is to host a workshop if you can instead of a readout. A lot of times, and it happens at AnswerLab too, readouts turn into a presentation, like this one I'm giving you today, where it's really one-sided. And it's just the UXR sort of walking through the findings. If you have the ability to do a workshop instead, especially within your organization, right, if you're a researcher in-house, it's going to create a lot of engagement. And you and the team together can go through the findings and the recommendations and bucket them into these categories, right? So that your workshop is sort of a catalyst for those next steps, right? It's a part, your readout becomes a part of the actions that are going to come from the findings. And then as I mentioned before, just one last customization, just one more plug for making sure recommendations are listed and prioritized in UX research reports by highest impact to the lowest impact to the user so that they can just feed right into the prioritization activity. Okay, so documenting. So the list of actions, which was like the end result of taking those steps for sort of turning your insights into actions, make it a checklist, right, is my advice here. Use that checklist with the owners assigned to it to keep track of what is actually done, right? Decisions made is one thing, but what actually gets launched? What changes get made? Attach dates, right, to all of the items in the action list. When did they happen? And create and maintain a running log of decisions that were made as a direct result of UX research. And then you can add to that list what was avoided. Because truly not acting as a result of UX research is still an important decision, right? Maybe you had a concept and the concept was really exciting, but then you talked to users and it turns out they didn't want the concept. And so you pivoted. Like that's a really big deal. And it shows really how impactful and important research is. So keeping track of poorly received concepts that were not fully fleshed out, right, or that pivoted, and keeping track of designs that weren't user-friendly, that never got developed, is another way to track and show the value of all the decisions that you are making based on research findings. And then finally, this is the hardest part probably, is measuring the impact. So it's great to track the value that your UX research is bringing, but when can you actually try to measure it? And there are a few ways that you can do this. So improved metrics is one of them, right? Metrics are great. So a couple ways you can do this. One is to do your testing benchmark, right? Do a benchmark and then test again over time on a set cadence to show improvement in your experience. And I got a question in the questions that could be submitted ahead to this webinar about the right cadence to test again on your benchmark. And of course, the answer is it depends. But what it depends on for me is how often you're launching changes to your product. So in a perfect world, if you are moving very quickly, maybe you have a large team of developers and you are on 2-week sprint cadence and you're launching out lots of new features and changes and updates all the time, I would recommend quarterly testing, retesting of the experience to see if that benchmark if you've improved on the benchmark. That said, a lot of organizations don't move that quickly with releasing changes to a specific product. And that's okay. If you really don't want to spend your resources doing benchmarking and retesting unless you have changed enough to move the needle, right? So if you've made enough changes to your product every 6 months, 6 months is great. If it's every year, that's okay too, right? It's still metrics that can help you show the impact of research. And then another way you can show how metrics are impacted by the experience, and I talked about this a lot in the first webinar, is to take your key performance indicators and map them to experiences, to core user journeys or critical user journeys in your product. And if you can map which journeys in the product impact the KPIs, when the KPIs improve, you can show how the experience is. The middle column there. So don't just ask yourself what was built and launched from UX research. You can also ask yourself what ideas were generated. So if you're doing evaluative research, maybe the users, the participants in your research are going to give you some like feature-specific ideas, right? And you want to add those to your roadmap. Or if you're doing foundational research, how does that research impact what's in your like long-term plan and vision for them? If you do research and those participants tell you, here's what I need, right? Here's what I need your product to be for me, and you move in that direction, the ideas that came from research are a great way to, and the impact of them is a great way to measure what's coming from your research. And then finally, it's really hard to measure what was avoided, but there are a couple ways you can try to do it. If you have built a customer experience that turns out to not be a good one, it turns out to be poor, you can keep track of that. Maybe you have some accessibility research findings, accessibility research projects, or you have those high impact findings that can come from any project. And you can use those to measure how you avoided alienating a specific population. And the other way you can measure this is how much time was not wasted, right? Designing, prototyping, or developing experiences that your customers didn't want or couldn't use, right? A lot of time and resources is another way you can measure the impact of UX research on the product. Okay, I am just going to quickly recap what I covered today before I move into a few Q&A questions. So I talked through 3 steps to go from insights to decisions, categorizing your findings and insights into common high impact, excuse me, into positive, positive, common, and high impact. Categorizing your recommendations into within your control with a clear solution, within your control, no clear solution, and outside your control. And then based on those categories, taking action, prioritize, solve, ship. And then I talked through some best practices for customizing the output of UX research to more easily flow into this framework, documenting the decisions that you make and avoid, and measuring impact. Okay, so I have a few minutes here. I think I have 7 to answer some questions. The first one here is, what steps, touch points, etc., do you recommend to ensure research insights make their way into product decisions made by PMs, engineers, and other designers? Okay, I love this question because what I outlined here today only works if your team makes time for it. So touch points are a great idea. I would recommend quite a few. So the first one, I would recommend a review cycle for stakeholders to weigh in on the discussion guide before research. Not weigh in on the way questions are asked, because crafting unbiased questions is the UXR's job, right? That's their area of expertise. But to keep the team engaged, right, and ensure that the researcher has their buy-in and that the team feels excited that what the researcher is going to ask in the sessions is going to tell them what actions to take. If you're doing qualitative session-based research, IDIs, I also recommend a touch point at the end of every session day. So at AnswerLab, we use an end-of-day recap email or an end-of-day debrief meeting, which can be just 15 minutes, to cover just the basics of that session day. How many participants were interviewed? How many from each segment, if that applies? How the sessions went overall? What are the emerging findings and themes? It can be just a few bullets. And if there are any impactful quotes, even if they're paraphrased, include those too. So if stakeholders and product managers are too busy to attend the sessions, which happens, this keeps them sort of updated, informed, and engaged. It also reduces surprises when the report comes, right? It's like a sneak peek for the UXR to feel aligned with the team, that they're delivering what the team needs with their data, and give them confidence going into reporting that the output is going to be useful and actionable. I also recommend having your readout or ideally your workshop immediately after the report is delivered. Often I see teams wait until they can get like every last stakeholder together, but calendars are crazy, and this really leads to decisions being delayed. So you want to capitalize on all that data being fresh in the researcher's head and just carry that momentum from the research directly into product decisions. And having a readout immediately is the best way to do that. So I recommend still invite a large group. So I love a large readout or workshop, but don't plan around everything, right? You can record it. And then schedule it early. So whenever the research project kicks off, as soon as you have a timeline, put a 1 hour or 90-minute hold on all of your stakeholders' calendars for the day after. Hold that time to look at the insights together. And then the final touch point I would recommend is a retro after each research project. And this can be much smaller, really. It can be just the product manager and the UXR, and just talk about how the project went, of course, but also be sure in the retro to talk about how were the findings actioned, what happened next, right, after I gave you my report. Has anything been launched? Were there any findings or recommendations that were not used or not launched, and why not, right? This is a great way for the researcher to learn what can be improved in their next project to ensure that the insights they give are even more actionable than the last. And if you're a researcher, at the very least, if you can't get a retro on calendars, send a quick survey to your stakeholders and get feedback on how your research was received in action. Okay, can you recommend some tools and best practices for tracking research and decisions? So I did talk about sort of documenting everything, but I'll just talk a little bit about ways I've seen clients do that, like specific to tools. I have seen a lot of them do it in tools like Airtable, Confluence, Jira. I've even seen like a spreadsheet. I just recommend using an existing tool. Again, like if you meet people where they are and you look at something your organization already uses and successfully, that's the place to document your decisions for your research. It's also a great place to house all your research, right? So another tool that you can do is you can build a research repository, right? Keep all of the UX research that your organization or your group has done in one place and make that place available to everyone. and ideally searchable, right? So that everyone can see what has been done, what's out there. They can learn from it. They can apply findings if applicable, and most importantly, not reinvent the wheel, right? Don't redo any research that's already done. If you have the answers, use the answers. And tool-wise, I mean, I've seen, again, Confluence, Airtable to be used for research repositories, or we've had clients, we've helped clients build them from scratch, right? To make sure everything is taggable and easy to maintain. It can really help you get more value from the research that you put out there. Okay, I have time for one more. Best practices for benchmarking. I got several questions about best practices for benchmarking, and I already answered the question about the timing of the benchmarking, but incorporating metrics into short iterative testing. So we do this, right? So benchmarking as a methodology is going to give you that larger sample size, much more similar to quant, where you are feeling really confident about your statistically significant findings. But if you're just doing N of 6 short usability, you can still ask repeated questions, right, about the product over time to build some metrics. Take a pool of questions, ask participants at the end of each session or each topic to rate on a scale things like how usable, how clear, how valuable. You just have to keep in mind that even though it'll give you a number, you can't, and you can put those numbers together into an average, or I'd recommend a median for this to remove outliers. The metrics just can't be treated the same way you would a quantitative or benchmarking the methodology metric. When you communicate them, you just have to be clear that you can't project them out onto your audience, right? You could say something like, these 6 participants rated the experience a 4 out of 5. When asked how clear or unclear, but you can't assume that if you ask 150, you would still get that 4 out of 5, right? So it's just being careful when you try to get a metric out of qualitative research, be really careful about how you communicate that metric out so it doesn't get confusing. Okay, I'm at time. Thanks so much. Back to you, Katie. Sorry.
No problem. All right, so thank you so much, everyone. I hope you found this useful. Just wanted to say a quick, keep an eye on your inbox for a follow-up email from our team. We'll be sharing a recording of the webinar, the slide deck, so you have all the info, and just a handful of other resources that might be helpful to you. And with that, thank you for all of your time today, and hope you have a great rest of your day.